Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the latest chapter of Tales from the Triverse, my ongoing sci-fi fantasy crime fiction serial. There's a new chapter every week, and today's is called Reality Snap. Previously, Lola Stiles has returned, albeit changed following a violent attack by a creature called a Vain-Ka. Clark and the others are still digesting all that they've heard. Addis Ababa, 1980, February. The silence was profound, an acknowledgement that there were no words that would be appropriate, no turn of phrase that would be equal to the task. Lola listened to the soft whirring of air conditioning from the ceiling. She'd had years to consider her telling of what had happened. It was only once they'd captured the Atlantic portal and had been able to receive news from mid-Earth that she'd discovered Clark and the others had escaped and were not in jail. Her first task was to find them, and here they were, Kaminsky, Chakraborty, Clark, Holland. She hadn't expected Holland. No backer, though. Perhaps they'd see about that at some point. The story had been curated, of course. She'd left out the more salacious moments. But otherwise, they now knew the truth of where she'd been, of what had happened to her. Inevitably, it was Frank Holland who spoke first. "You fucking tough son of a bitch," he said, staring at her, then pacing the room. "Fuck me. No word of a lie." She rolled up the sleeve on one arm and showed him the seam, where the skin colour changed. "Motherfucker," Holland said, as if escalating his curses in pursuit of one that would properly encapsulate the moment. He stopped his pacing, and stared at her again. She couldn't work out what was going through his head. "Fuck me, I thought you were a spoiled little girl." Lola raised her middle finger. "Well, fuck you." The man stared, his stare so intense, so fixed upon her that she wondered if he'd ever break away, or would be forever locked onto her. Then he broke into a massive grin, bellowed a laugh, and pointed at Detective Burhane. "You," he said, "Burhane, whatever your name is. Can we get something a bit more than this mud coffee? We need to celebrate this badass motherfucker back from the dead former colleague who I completely fucking underestimated the entire time I was working with her." Impressing Frank Holland hadn't been on Lola's bucket list. It felt somewhat distasteful, as if she must have done something seriously wrong to have won his approval. While Holland went to hassle Burhane for directions to the nearest bar, she was distracted by Chakraborty, approaching suddenly and flinging her arms around her. "Nisha," said Lola, hugging her in return. "It's okay." "Why are you telling me it's okay? Jesus Christ, Lola. I'm so sorry. It must have been so difficult." "It was, but I had good people helping me." "I know I don't look like it," Chakraborty said, stepping away and fanning her face with her hand, "but I'm so happy to see you. It feels like a dream or something." Chakraborty seemed well. She looked rested, more than she'd ever been back in London. The sunken eyes were lifted and bright. The smile seemed less forced. Across the table Kaminsky sat, hands jittering in front of him, eyes lowered. He was frozen in place. That was fine. She'd give him time to figure out how to react. There was a noise, and she looked over to Clark, also still sat, his face covered by one hand. She moved around to him and pulled up a chair. His shoulders shuddered, and he looked away from her. He pinched the bridge of his nose, took a deep breath, then looked back. His eyes were red. "Should have been there," he said. "Should have been there. I'm sorry, Lola." "It's okay." "No." His voice louder perhaps than he'd intended, more forceful. "You shouldn't have had to go through this alone." "I wasn't alone. I had friends." "But not us." Another deep, cracked breath. "Not me. I wasn't there." She held his hand. "Right, but I thought you might be here, and that helped." The Addis portal station was a statement. It was Ethiopia declaring, "We can do this better than you." London's hub seemed paltry by comparison, almost primitive, yet it remained the centre of the Triverse. There was a time Holland had disliked the general concept of other places. He was born in London, lived in London his whole life, worked in London. He knew the streets, the people. London was a shithole, but it was his shithole, and it was the best place on mid-earth. One of the problems having to leave London was being faced with mounting evidence that he'd had it all backwards. It had taken him years to admit it, but it was true. For all its bluster, London was falling behind, and clearly had been for decades. The Kingdom of Great Britain powered on through its own sheer momentum, rather than innovation. It had the world's biggest power stations, the deepest coal mines, the strongest industry and manufacturing, the broadest coalition of nations across every continent, but it was old and slow and stubborn. Addis Ababa, by contrast, felt like the future. Not a Max Earth, AI-driven hyper-future, but a warmer, more human mix of innovation, technology, culture. Holland had found it distasteful and odd on his first visit 5 years ago, when they were running for their lives. Returning, after years circling the drain on Max Earth, he could see it with clearer eyes. At the very least, he'd spent the previous half-decade pleased with himself for doing the right thing. He knew he was an arsehole, but he'd always been good at his job. When it mattered, he'd made a choice. He had to cling to it being the right thing because the alternative was far worse. That choice, to turn on Miller and hand the evidence to Bakker, had resulted in Miller's death and their exile. Bakker's fate was still up in the air. Word was that he'd retired, but that could mean all sorts of things, few of them good. He'd done the right thing, and they'd entirely failed. If he'd stuck with Miller, he'd still have his job. He'd still be in London, carrying on as normal. Clark and Bakker and the others would be in jail most likely, but they were grown-ups. They'd made their choices. Holland wasn't interested in the path untrodden. Regret wasn't an indulgence he allowed himself. He waved at the bartender, took 2 bottles of champagne, then headed back towards the conference room, past the botanical gardens and the fountains that filled the portal station. That sacrifice he'd made of choosing Bakker over Miller, of condemning them all to exile, had at least confirmed that he was the man. Nobody messed with Detective Frank Holland. Nobody manipulated him or got to tell him what to do. He was the tough cop, the one who got the job done, who didn't much care for the rules and put bad guys away. He'd kept to that promise, had followed his gut, as always. He'd taken a bullet for it. At the end of it, he could say with certainty that he was one tough son of a bitch. And then Lola Stiles had returned, in all her Frankenstein glory, and had put them all to shame with her trials. They'd been having fucking garden parties compared to her. Lola Stiles, the tiny blonde thing that had shown up in the office on Stamford and Coyne, there to replace Callaghan after his death. Jesus, John Callaghan, that was a name he hadn't thought about in years. That's where it had started, for all of them. He'd died chasing phantoms, and the rest of them had run a little too close to danger time and again. Sooner or later it'd get them all. He took a breath at the door to the conference room, then shouldered it open. Holding up the champagne bottles, he declared a celebration, putting on that tough guy face. The man, the ballsiest fucking cop in London. Nobody messed with Frank Holland. But after this, he was out. Thanks for listening. You can leave a comment and find out a lot more over on the newsletter version at simonkjones.substack.com.